I woke up to the sound of my wife asking doctors to let me die. I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to open my eyes, unable to move my fingers, unable to tell anyone that I could hear every word. After 30 years of marriage, the first thing I heard from Sandra was a decision about my death. If his heart stops, don't bring him back. Those words entered my mind before I even understood where I was. For a moment, I thought the medication was creating a nightmare. But then I heard the nurse respond, and I realized this was real. The woman I trusted with my entire life was discussing whether I should be saved. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is Matt Harris. I was 58 years old when I discovered that the people closest to you can sometimes become the people you need to protect yourself from. 3 days earlier, I had been driving home when a delivery truck ran a red light and changed everything I thought I knew about my future. The doctors said my injuries were severe. They placed me in a medically induced coma to give my body time to heal. My family was told I might recover, but nobody knew when. Nobody knew that my mind would wake before my body did. At first, there was only darkness. I could hear machines beside me and nurses moving around the room. I tried to speak. Nothing happened. I tried to move. Nothing happened. Then Sandra walked into the room with my oldest son, Carl. I recognized their voices immediately. They were talking about my condition, but the conversation quickly changed. The nurse explained that my condition was serious but stable. There was still hope. Then Sandra asked about a DNR order. She said I would not want to live connected to machines. I wanted to scream because she was wrong. I had never said that, not once. I had spent my entire life fighting through difficult moments. I built Harris Supply through hard work. I survived losses. I was not a man who wanted someone else to decide when my life was finished. Then Carl spoke. Mom is right. Dad always said he wouldn't want this. My heart raced. My own son was telling strangers what I supposedly wanted without ever hearing those words from me. I could not open my eyes, but I felt something change. This was no longer about my accident. It was about what my family believed they could do while I was unable to stop them. When the nurse left the room, I expected Sandra and Carl to leave too. They didn't. Instead, Carl lowered his voice and asked, "What happens to the company if he doesn't wake up?" That question hurt more than the lie about the DNR. Not because I was surprised they cared about money, because they were asking about it while I was still alive. Sandra warned him not to talk too loudly. Carl asked about accounts, business control, and what would happen next. They were not speaking like people waiting for a loved one to recover. They were speaking like people planning for what they would receive if I never opened my eyes again. I stayed completely still. Every part of me wanted to reveal the truth. I wanted to open my eyes and ask how they could do this. But I knew, if they discovered I was awake, the conversation would stop. Whatever they were hiding would disappear behind excuses. So I made a decision. I would let them believe I was helpless. I would listen. I would remember every word, because my family had no idea that the man lying in that hospital bed was not gone. I was still there. And before they realized their mistake, they were going to reveal exactly what they planned to do with everything I spent my life building. After the first night in the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not reveal that I was awake, not yet. The only advantage I had was the one thing my family didn't know existed, my silence. As long as they believed I was unconscious, they would continue showing me who they really were. The next morning, I heard Sandra beside my bed again. Her voice sounded gentle when the nurse entered. She spoke about my recovery, my medications, and how difficult the last few days had been. Anyone listening would have believed she was a devoted wife. I almost believed it myself. That was the hardest part. Betrayal is painful because it comes from someone who once gave you every reason to trust them. Sandra and I had built a life together for 30 years. We had faced financial struggles, family problems, and moments when giving up would have been easier. I remembered the woman who stayed beside me when I lost my father. I remembered the woman who held my hand when Harris Supply almost failed during its early years. I remembered the person I thought would stand beside me until the end. But the voice I heard in that hospital room belonged to someone I no longer recognized. Later that day, Carl returned. He hugged me, and told the nurses how lucky everyone was that I survived. He held my hand and called me Dad. If I had not heard him earlier, I might have believed every word. Instead, I listened carefully. He asked the doctors questions about my recovery, but his attention always returned to what happened next. When would I return to the company? Who was handling decisions? How long would it take before things became normal again? Normal. That word stayed with me, because nothing about what I had heard felt normal. My son Adrian arrived that evening. He was the one I had trusted most with Harris Supply. I had raised him since he was 6 years old. His biological father disappeared from his life, but I never treated him like anything less than my own son. I paid for his education. I taught him the business. I gave him a position in the company because I believed he had the patience and judgment to protect what I built. When he stood beside my hospital bed and said, "The company needs stability," I wanted to believe he meant helping me recover. But then he added, "Someone has to make decisions if Dad can't. Someone, not me. Not when I recover. If I can't." Those words stayed with me. Over the next few days, I listened while my family slowly revealed their priorities. Carl asked about investments. Eva asked about the house. Adrian discussed company authority. Sandra answered carefully, always reminding them not to speak too openly. The strange thing was not that they were thinking about the future. Everyone thinks about practical matters during a crisis. The strange thing was the way they talked. There was no fear that they might lose me. There was only frustration about uncertainty. They were waiting for an answer to a question they believed had already been decided. Would I wake up? And if I didn't, what would happen next? That realization hurt more than I expected. I had spent my entire life believing the things I built were ways to protect my family. The company, the house, the savings. Everything I worked for was meant to give them security. I never imagined those same things could become the reason they became impatient for me to disappear. Then I heard something that changed the way I viewed everything. Adrian asked Sandra whether he already had access to the accounts he needed. She answered, "For now." 2 simple words, but they carried a meaning I could not ignore. For now meant there was a plan. For now meant something had already started. I lay there pretending to be unconscious while my own family discussed pieces of my life as if I were no longer part of it. I wanted answers. I wanted to know how long this had been happening. But more than anything, I needed proof. Because anger would not protect me. Accusations would not protect me. Only the truth would. So I continued pretending. I let them believe the accident had taken more from me than my ability to move. I let them believe I was confused, weak, and dependent. But inside, I was watching. I was remembering. And every conversation was giving me another piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. The more I listened, the more I understood that my family was not simply preparing for my recovery. They were preparing for my absence. I needed the truth before I made my next move. The hardest part was not lying there unable to move. The hardest part was knowing I could move and choosing not to. Every instinct inside me wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to look at Sandra and ask why. I wanted to ask Adrian when he stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as an opportunity. But I knew one thing. The moment they knew I was awake, everything would change. People reveal the truth when they believe they are safe. So I stayed silent. I let the machines continue their rhythm. I let the nurses believe I was slowly recovering. And I let my family believe they were alone with their thoughts. The next few days became a lesson in listening. I learned more while pretending not to understand than I ever could have by confronting them. Sandra visited every morning. She held my hand. She talked about ordinary things, the weather, the house, the bills. She played the role of a worried wife perfectly, but every time someone mentioned my future, her voice changed slightly. She became more careful, more controlled, like someone who was protecting information instead of protecting me. Adrian visited almost every day too. He spoke about Harris Supply with confidence. He told everyone that employees needed stability and that he was making sure operations continued. On the surface, it sounded responsible. A son helping his injured father. But I noticed something important. He never asked when I might return. He only talked about what needed to happen while I was gone. That difference mattered. One afternoon, I heard Adrian speaking with Sandra outside my room. He asked whether the company documents had been organized. Sandra told him she was handling everything. "We need to be careful," she whispered. "Matt could wake up at any time." That sentence made my entire body tense. Not because she was worried about my recovery, because she was worried about timing. They were not waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for the moment when they knew what they could do without me. Later that evening, Carl returned. He spoke more openly than the others. Maybe because he believed I could not hear him. He asked Sandra about the trust fund again. He asked whether there were restrictions. He asked how quickly money could be accessed. I listened carefully. Not because I was shocked that my children cared about finances. Money affects families. Planning matters. But there was a difference between preparing for a possibility and waiting for an outcome. Their conversations sounded less like concern and more like calculation. I started keeping a mental record. Every name, every question, every unusual phrase. Adrian, company authority. Carl, trust fund and money access. Eva, estate documents. Sandra, controlling the information. I repeated those details in my mind because I needed to remember everything exactly. I could not afford to let emotions change the facts. That was something I had learned over decades in business. A feeling can tell you something is wrong. Evidence tells you why. The 7th day after my accident, a doctor entered my room and explained that my condition was improving. They might begin reducing the medication soon. Sandra sounded relieved, but after the doctor left, she made a phone call. I could not hear the person on the other end, but I heard her say one sentence clearly. "No, don't do anything else yet. We don't know if he is going to wake up." I felt a cold feeling move through me. Don't do anything else yet. Those words were not about hope. They were about a plan being paused. Something had already happened. Something else was waiting. That night, I made a decision. I would stop trying to understand their excuses. I would start looking for proof. When the nurses asked me to respond, I would respond slowly. When my body recovered, I would recover quietly. I would become exactly what they expected. A man who needed help. A man who remembered nothing. A man they could control. But they were wrong about one thing. My silence was not weakness. It was the only advantage I had left. And while they believed they were preparing for a future without me, I was preparing for the truth that would change everything. I stayed motionless in that hospital bed while the people I loved slowly revealed what they truly thought about my future. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives with one shocking moment. Sometimes it arrives through small conversations. A question asked too early. A decision made too quickly. A person speaking about your life as if you were already gone. That was what hurt the most. My family was not waiting beside my bed hoping I would come back. They were waiting to see what would happen if I didn't. Over the next several days, I listened carefully. I learned the rhythm of their conversations. Sandra always started by reminding everyone to be careful. She was the person who controlled the information. Carl asked about money. Eva asked about documents. But Adrian was different. Adrian talked like someone who had already stepped into my position. He did not ask whether I would return to Harris Supply. He discussed what needed to happen while I was unavailable. One afternoon, I heard him speaking with a senior manager from the company on the phone beside my room. His voice was calm and professional. "Don't make any major changes until I review everything," he said. "We need consistency during this transition." Transition. That word stayed with me. A transition meant something was ending and something else was beginning. But I was not gone. I was lying 6 feet away, listening to my son talk about my company like it was already his responsibility. Harris Supply was not just a business to me. It was 30 years of sacrifice. I remembered the early days when I worked late nights because payroll was due. I remembered knowing every employee's name because they were not just workers. They were people who trusted me. I built that company so my family would have security. I never imagined that one day my family would discuss it like a prize waiting to be claimed. The next day, Carl returned. He was more direct than Adrian. Maybe he was less careful. He pulled a chair beside my bed and lowered his voice. "Mom, We need to know what happens with the trust. Sandra immediately told him not to discuss it there. But she did not sound angry because the question was wrong. She sounded worried because someone might hear. There will be time for that, she said. Carl sighed. I'm just trying to understand what happens if he doesn't recover. If he doesn't recover. Again, those words. They kept saying them like they were preparing for an unavoidable event instead of a possibility. I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to ask Carl what happened to the father who paid for his education and supported him when he needed help. Instead, I stayed still, because every painful sentence was becoming evidence. Later that evening, Eva arrived with flowers. She kissed my forehead and told Sandra how difficult everything had been. She talked about work, her children, and how stressful the last week was. Then, after a few minutes, she asked the question I had started expecting. Did anyone find Dad's estate papers? I felt my stomach tighten. Estate papers, not recovery plans. Not medical questions, not whether I was improving. Documents, money, control. Sandra answered that Adrian was handling the business situation because Harris Supply needed someone responsible while I was unconscious. Eva did not question it. She simply nodded. That reaction bothered me more than I expected. It meant this conversation had happened before. They were not discovering these ideas beside my hospital bed. They were continuing a discussion that had already started somewhere else. That night, after everyone left, Sandra remained beside me. She held my hand and spoke softly. We're going to take care of everything. For a moment, those words sounded like comfort. The kind of thing a wife should say to a husband in a hospital bed. But I had heard those same words before, not as reassurance, as a promise that they would handle my life without me. I wondered how long they had been preparing for this. How many conversations had happened before my accident? How many decisions had already been made? The next morning, Adrian came alone. He stood near my bed and spoke quietly. Dad, I know you would want the company protected. I almost reacted, because there was something painful about hearing him use what he believed I would want. He was speaking for me while I was still alive. I promise I won't let anything happen to what you built. That sentence should have comforted me. Instead, it frightened me, because the person saying it was the same person discussing taking control of it. When Adrian left, I continued staring into the darkness. I finally understood something important. The danger was not that my family wanted security after I was gone. Wanting security was human. The danger was that they had already started making decisions before knowing whether I would survive. They had moved from hoping for my recovery to planning around my absence. And that meant there was something they wanted badly enough to risk everything. I still did not know the full truth. I did not know who had done what. I did not know whether they were all involved, or only some of them. But I knew one thing. The accident had not created their behavior. It had only revealed it. My coma did not change my family. It removed the one thing that had been hiding their intentions, my ability to answer back. So I stayed silent a little longer. Because before I confronted anyone, I needed to know exactly what they had already taken from me. And more importantly, I needed to know how far they were willing to go. I opened my eyes on the 7th day, but I did not open them as the same man who had entered that hospital. The man who woke up knew something the others didn't. He knew exactly what his family thought had happened. They believed I had been unconscious. They believed I remembered nothing. They believed the conversations they had whispered beside my bed would disappear with the fog of medication. They were wrong. When Sandra saw my eyes open, she immediately started crying. She grabbed my hand and called for the nurse. "Matt, can you hear me?" she asked. I looked at her slowly, exactly the way someone recovering from a serious accident should look. Confused, weak, lost. I waited before answering. "Sandra?" My voice was quiet. Her expression softened with relief. The doctors arrived and began asking questions. My name, the date, where I was. I answered carefully. Some things quickly, some things slowly. I gave them exactly what they expected to see. A man returning from a difficult medical event. A man who needed time. A man who was not ready to make decisions yet. Nobody questioned it. That was the moment I realized something important. People do not only underestimate the weak. Sometimes they become careless around them. Carl came later that afternoon. He hugged me and told me how scared everyone had been. I looked at him and thanked him. I wanted to ask him why he lied about my wishes. I wanted to ask him how he could sit beside my hospital bed and discuss my future as if I was already gone. But I said nothing. Not yet. Adrian arrived shortly after. He stood near the end of the bed with a confident smile. "Dad, don't worry about anything at work. I've handled everything." I nodded slowly. "The company?" I asked. He smiled. "Everything is under control." Those words confirmed what I already suspected. Adrian was not waiting for my return. He was enjoying the authority my absence created. Over the next several days, I continued playing the role of a recovering patient. When Sandra talked about bills, I asked her to repeat the numbers. When Adrian discussed business, I pretended the details were too complicated for me to process. When Carl mentioned family decisions, I looked confused and changed the subject. The weaker I appeared, the more comfortable they became. Sandra began answering questions before I could respond. Adrian started making decisions without asking my opinion. They did not notice because they wanted to believe it. They needed to believe I was no longer the person who controlled my own life. After I returned home, the performance continued. Sandra insisted I rest. She handled the mail. She organized appointments. She reminded me not to worry about Harris Supply. "Let Adrian take care of things for now," she said. "For now." That phrase again. I smiled and thanked her. Then, every night after she went to sleep, I wrote everything down. The DNR conversation. Carl's questions about money. Eva asking about estate documents. Adrian discussing control of the company. Sandra's phone call saying, "Don't do anything else yet." I wrote dates, times, exact words. I did not trust my memory alone. I needed facts, because if I confronted them too early, they could claim I misunderstood. They could say the accident affected my thinking. They could turn me into the confused old man they already believed I was becoming. 10 days after returning home, Adrian called me. "Dad, you don't need to rush back to Harris Supply. Take another month if you need it." His voice sounded supportive, but I heard what he did not say. He did not ask if I wanted to return. He told me I didn't need to. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I walked into my office, the same office where I had made thousands of decisions over the years. The same room where I built a company from an idea into something employees depended on. I opened the drawer and took out an old business card. Ray Bennett. An attorney I had worked with years earlier. Someone who knew business law but had never represented Sandra, Adrian, or anyone in my family. That mattered. I did not need someone protecting my family. I needed someone protecting the truth. The next morning, I told Sandra I needed a short drive. She immediately reminded me not to overdo it. I smiled and promised I would be careful. She believed she was protecting me. She did not know I was finally protecting myself. I drove past Harris Supply without stopping. I kept going until I reached Ray's office. For the first time since the accident, I was not pretending to be weak because I was afraid. I was pretending to be weak because I was preparing. My family believed my coma had taken away my power. They did not realize it had given me something more valuable. Time. Time to listen, time to investigate. Time to discover what they had done while they believed I would never wake up. And now I was ready to find out exactly what they were hiding. Ray Bennett listened, without interrupting. That was the first thing I noticed about him. He did not react emotionally. He did not immediately tell me what he thought. He simply listened and wrote down every detail. The DNR conversation. Carl's lie about my wishes. Sandra's questions about what would happen if I never woke up. Adrian talking about control of Harris Supply. The mysterious phone call where Sandra said, "Don't do anything else yet." When I finished, Ray placed his pen on the table. "Matt, I need to ask you one thing." I looked at him. "Does your family know you remember any of this?" "No." He nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it that way." Those words confirmed why I chose him. He was not interested in emotions. He was interested in protecting the truth. If they know you are investigating, they will stop talking, Ray said. They will clean up whatever they can. They will explain away whatever looks suspicious. I leaned back in the chair. So what do we do? Ray opened a blank folder. We find out what is real. That was exactly what I wanted. I was not interested in accusing my family because I was hurt. Pain can make people see enemies everywhere. I needed facts. If my family had simply spoken carelessly because they were afraid of losing me, I needed to know that too. But if they had crossed a legal line, I needed proof. Ray asked about access to my company and personal accounts. I explained that Sandra handled some household matters. Adrian was vice president of Harris Supply. He had authority in certain business decisions, but not complete control. And the others? Ray asked. Carl and Eva? I shook my head. They should not have access to company information. Ray wrote that down. Then he made a call. Less than an hour later, Frank Dolan walked into the office. Frank was a private investigator who specialized in financial cases. He did not ask me what I thought happened. He asked me what I knew. That difference mattered. I gave him names, dates, company information. Everything I remembered hearing in the hospital. When I started explaining why I suspected Adrian, Frank stopped me. Tell me what happened, Matt. Don't tell me what it means. I'll figure that part out. I respected that. Facts first. Conclusions later. Frank began by reviewing public records connected to Harris Supply. Then he looked into companies connected to Adrian. For the next several days, I continued pretending everything was normal at home. Sandra believed I was still recovering. Adrian believed I was too weak to return to the company. Every day they underestimated me, gave Frank more time. 4 days later, Ray called and asked me to come back to his office. Frank was already there with several documents spread across the table. We found something, he said. I sat down. The first document showed payments leaving Harris Supply. At first glance, they looked normal. Transportation costs, logistics services, equipment expenses, ordinary things for a supply company. What's wrong with these? I asked. Frank pointed to the company receiving the money. Cooper Logistics, LLC. Have you heard of them? I looked at the name. I had not. No, Frank nodded. That is what I was hoping you would say. He explained that Cooper Logistics had been created 3 years earlier. The address connected to the company was not a warehouse. It was a registered mailbox location. There were no verified trucks, no employees, no real operations. I looked back at the payment records. How much? Frank turned another page. The amount made me sit back. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had moved through the company over time. Who owns it? I asked. Frank was quiet for a moment before answering. The connection leads back to Adrian. I stared at the documents. I wanted to reject it immediately. I wanted to find another explanation. Because even after everything I heard in the hospital, part of me was still a father before I was a businessman. Adrian was the child I raised, the boy I taught to work hard, the person I trusted enough to bring into the company I built. Are you certain? I asked. We are still tracing everything, Frank replied. But the connection is strong. I looked at the dates again. The payments did not start after my accident. They started years earlier. That realization changed everything. My accident had not created the problem. My coma had simply created an opportunity for someone to believe they could hide it forever. Ray leaned forward. Matt, this is important. Do not confront Adrian. I looked at him. Even now? Especially now. He explained that if Adrian knew what we found, he could destroy records, move money, or create a story before we understood the full picture. I hated waiting. Every part of me wanted to walk into Harris Supply and demand answers. But I had already made one mistake in life. I had trusted people without asking enough questions. I was not going to make another. That evening I returned home, carrying none of the documents. Sandra was preparing dinner when I walked in. She smiled and asked if the drive had helped me feel better. A little, I said. She kissed my cheek and told me she was glad I was slowly getting back to myself. I looked at the woman who had stood beside me for 30 years and wondered how much of my life had been real. Later that night, while Sandra slept, I sat alone in my office. The company I built, the family I trusted, The future I thought I had secured. Everything suddenly looked different. But one thing was becoming clear. The people who wanted me to believe I was powerless had forgotten something important. I was still the person who built Harris Supply, and I still knew how to uncover the truth. The next report from Frank changed the way I looked at everything. The first time I saw Cooper Logistics, I thought it might be a mistake, a misunderstanding, a business connection I simply did not know about. Harris Supply was a large company. We worked with many vendors. It was possible there was an explanation, but after Frank finished tracing the transactions, there was no explanation left that made sense. Cooper Logistics was not a real business. It was a name created to move money. Over 3 years, Harris Supply had sent 43 payments to that company. The amounts were carefully divided. Nothing was large enough to immediately attract attention. A transportation charge here. An equipment expense there. Small enough to disappear inside a company that handled millions of dollars every year. But when Frank added everything together, the total was more than $500,000. I stared at the number for a long time. $500,000. Money that belonged to the company. Money that belonged to employees, operations, and the future I had spent decades building. Adrian controls Cooper Logistics? I asked. Frank nodded. The ownership trail leads back to him. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I was not thinking like a businessman. I was thinking like a father. I remembered Adrian at 6 years old, holding my hand when he was afraid. I remembered teaching him how to fix things in the garage. I remembered the day I offered him his first position at Harris Supply. He was not my biological son, but I never treated him differently. I gave him my name. I gave him opportunities. I gave him trust. And now, according to the evidence in front of me, he had spent years taking from the very company I expected him to protect. When did this start? I asked. Frank pointed to the records. 3 years ago. 3 years. That number hurt because it meant the accident had nothing to do with the beginning of this. The hospital conversations were not the start of the betrayal. They were simply the moment Adrian believed he had finally been given enough time to hide it. Ray looked at me carefully. Matt, we need to separate what we know from what we suspect. I nodded. That was important. I was angry. More angry than I had been in my life. But anger could not build a case. Evidence could. What do we know? I asked. Frank explained. We knew Cooper Logistics received money from Harris Supply. We knew the company had no verified operations. We knew Adrian was connected to it. But there were still questions. Who approved the payments? Who helped process the paperwork? Who else knew? That last question stayed with me. Because a company does not lose $500,000 through one person's actions without someone noticing. Someone saw the numbers. Someone approved documents. Someone looked away. Frank continued searching through internal records. He found that most transactions carried Adrian's authorization. That was expected. But 11 payments required a second approval because they exceeded internal limits. I expected to see the name of our accounting manager. Instead, I saw another name, Sandra Harris, my wife's name. I looked at the document again, then again. Are you certain? I asked. Frank nodded carefully. The records show her approval. We still need a formal review to determine exactly what she knew. I felt something inside me go quiet. In the hospital, I had heard Sandra protecting Adrian. I had heard her discussing what would happen if I never woke up. But I had still hoped she was simply afraid. I had hoped maybe she was being manipulated. Now another possibility appeared. Maybe she was not just protecting him. Maybe she was involved. Ray reminded me not to make assumptions. We follow the evidence, Matt. I nodded, because he was right. The woman I married for 30 years deserved the same fairness I expected from everyone else. Even if the truth hurt, the investigation continued. Frank found emails connected to several of the transactions. Some documents had been forwarded through accounts Sandra regularly used. It did not prove everything yet, but it placed her much closer to the situation than she should have been. I sat there looking at the files spread across the table. The accident, the DNR conversation, the questions about my money, the company transfers, the suspicious approvals. Everything was beginning to connect. My family had not suddenly changed after my accident. My accident had simply exposed what had already been happening. That evening, I returned home and acted exactly as I had before. Sandra asked how I felt. I told her I was tired. Adrian called to update me about Harris Supply. I thanked him and pretended not to notice how comfortable he sounded discussing my company. They believed I was still recovering. They believed I was still the man who needed them. They had no idea I was no longer trying to recover from the accident. I was recovering from the truth, and the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Adrian had not just made a mistake. He had built a system. Sandra might not have been a victim of that system. She might have been one of the people helping him build it. The next question was no longer how much had Adrian taken. The question was how many people I loved had known exactly what he was doing and chose silence. The hardest truth to accept was not that Adrian had betrayed me. As painful as it was, part of me had already prepared for that possibility. The hardest truth was realizing Adrian might not have acted alone. Because betrayal from one person hurts. Betrayal from an entire family changes the way you see your whole life. I returned to Ray's office the next morning expecting more information about Cooper Logistics. Instead, Frank placed another folder on the table. There is something else you need to see. I opened the folder and immediately recognized the name on the documents. Sandra Harris. My wife's signature appeared on 11 separate transactions connected to Cooper Logistics. 11 times, she approved payments that moved money away from the company I built. I stared at the papers without speaking. Could someone have forged these? I asked. Frank nodded. That's possible. That's why we are verifying everything. But right now, the records show her involvement. I appreciated that he did not give me the answer I wanted. He gave me the answer supported by facts. For 30 years, Sandra had been the person I trusted most. She knew every part of my life. She knew the sacrifices behind Harris Supply. She knew how many nights I stayed awake worrying about employees, customers, and whether the company would survive. She knew that business was never just about money to me. It was about responsibility. And now, her name was appearing beside transactions that looked like they were designed to take from everything I had built. When did these approvals happen? I asked. Frank showed me the dates. Many occurred during the same period Adrian was expanding his control inside the company. The timing was not a coincidence. But before I could say anything else, Frank placed another folder in front of me. There is a personal matter as well. I almost stopped him. The business betrayal was already difficult enough. But then I saw the photographs. Sandra leaving restaurants with another man. Sandra at hotels on dates when she had told me she was somewhere else. His name was Scott Wheeler, a physical therapist, 34 years old. The evidence showed the relationship had lasted approximately 14 months. I looked at the dates again. 14 months. Longer than I had known anything was wrong. Longer than the conversations I thought were normal. Longer than I realized my marriage had already changed. I did not feel anger immediately. I felt something quieter, something heavier, because money could be counted, documents could be reviewed. But trust was different. Trust was something you gave someone once and expected them to protect. Are you certain? I asked. Frank nodded. The records matched the timeline. I closed the folder. I did not need more pictures. I did not need more details. I already understood enough. But the day was not finished. Frank had one more discovery. This time, it involved Eva, my daughter. Frank explained that Eva had discovered suspicious payments connected to Cooper Logistics almost a year earlier while helping with paperwork at Harris Supply. She had noticed something unusual. She had followed the records. She had enough information to know something was wrong, but she never told me. Why? I asked. Frank placed another set of records on the table. Payments from Adrian to Eva. They were smaller than the company transfers. They were disguised as reimbursements and personal loans. But the pattern was clear. Money had moved from Adrian to Eva after she discovered what he was doing. I stared at those transactions for a long time. Eva had not stolen from the company directly. She had not created Cooper Logistics. But she knew something was wrong and chose silence. That hurt in a different way. Adrian had betrayed me through greed. Sandra appeared to have betrayed me through greed and deception, but Eva had betrayed me through silence. Sometimes silence is its own decision. Ray watched me carefully. Matt, we need to be precise. We cannot assume everyone had the same level of involvement. I nodded. He was right. I did not want revenge. I wanted the truth. If someone made a mistake, the evidence would show it. If someone made a choice, the evidence would show that too. That evening, I drove home and saw Sandra sitting in the living room. She smiled when I walked in. "You look tired," she said. "Did you have a good day?" I looked at the woman who had shared my home for 3 decades. The woman who had held my hand through difficult times. The woman whose signature might have helped someone steal from me. "It was a long day," I answered. She reached for my hand. "I'm glad you're getting stronger." I almost pulled away. Almost. But I remembered why I was still pretending. They still did not know what I had discovered. They still believed I was weak. They still believed they were ahead. That was their mistake. Because while they were waiting for the old Matt Harris to return, they did not realize something had changed. The man who woke up in that hospital bed was not looking for a way to save the family he lost. He was looking for the truth about the family he thought he had. And soon, every person involved would have to answer for their own choices. The hardest part was not discovering what my family had done. The hardest part was sitting across from them every day and pretending I knew nothing. After leaving Ray's office, I returned home and continued playing the same role. I was still the injured husband recovering from a terrible accident. I was still the father who needed time before making decisions. I was still the man they believed they could guide. But inside, everything had changed. I was no longer searching for answers. I had them. Now I needed to protect the truth. Ray helped me review my accounts, my company records, and every document connected to Harris Supply. I did not want to act out of anger. Anger creates mistakes. I wanted every decision to be legal and impossible to challenge. For 30 years, I had trusted my family with access to my life. Now I had to create boundaries because the people closest to me had shown me why boundaries mattered. Changing my estate was the hardest decision. Not because of money, because every name I removed belonged to someone I once believed would always stand beside me. Sandra, Adrian, Eva, Carl. They were my wife and children. They were the people I worked for, sacrificed for, and protected. But I finally understood that love did not mean giving someone unlimited power to hurt me. Ray documented every change carefully. He reminded me this was not revenge. This was protection. Protection of my company. Protection of my future. Protection of my right to decide what happened to everything I built. Meanwhile, my family continued believing their plan was working. Sandra still managed the house like nothing had changed. Adrian still spoke about Harris Supply as if he already controlled it. Carl and Eva acted as if the conversations beside my hospital bed had never happened. They had no idea I remembered every word. They had no idea I had evidence. They had no idea the man they considered weak was preparing for the moment they would have to answer. Then Sandra mentioned our 30th wedding anniversary. She wanted to invite friends and family to celebrate my recovery and our marriage. I agreed immediately. "Invite everyone," I told her. A smile appeared on her face. She believed I was returning to the man she knew. She had no idea I was returning as someone who knew the truth. Over the next few days, I prepared everything. Adrian's file contained the company records, suspicious transactions, and evidence connected to his decisions. Sandra's file contained the financial records and questions about her involvement. Eva and Carl had their own files too. Not because I wanted to destroy them, because every person deserved to face the consequences of their own actions. The night before the anniversary, I stood alone in my office. I looked at the photographs on the wall. The early days of Harris Supply. My children growing up. Moments when I believed I was building something that would keep my family together forever. I felt sadness, but not regret. Loving them was never my mistake. Trusting without protecting myself was. The next evening, everyone arrived. Friends filled the house. Sandra smiled. Adrian talked about business. Everyone believed they were attending a celebration. They believed I had survived the accident and returned home grateful. They were right. I was grateful because I had been given another chance to see the truth. When dinner ended, I slowly stood up and picked up the first envelope from the table. The room became quiet. Sandra looked at me. "Matt, what are those?" she asked. I looked at the people who once meant everything to me and said, "There are things you need to know about what happened while I was in the hospital." The room remained silent after Adrian was taken away. For the first time in weeks, nobody was pretending. No more careful smiles, no more false concern. No more conversations whispered beside my hospital bed while believing I could not hear. The truth was finally standing in the open. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. Because when the people who hurt you are strangers, justice feels simple. But when they are the people you loved most, justice comes with pain. The investigation continued after that night. Harris Supply was protected. The fraudulent transactions were reviewed. The documents Adrian created while I was unconscious were challenged. The money that could be recovered was traced back. Every step was handled through the proper channels. I never wanted to destroy my family. I wanted to stop them from destroying me. Sandra and I eventually ended our marriage. 30 years together did not disappear in one night, and I would never pretend those years meant nothing. There were good memories. There were moments when she was the person who stood beside me when nobody else did. But those memories could not erase what happened. Trust is not broken because someone makes one mistake. Trust is broken when someone repeatedly chooses to protect themselves at your expense. Adrian faced the consequences of what he had done. He lost the position he had tried to take before I was even gone. He had to answer questions about decisions he once believed nobody would examine. For years, I had taught him how to build something. I never imagined I would one day have to teach him that what you build with dishonesty eventually falls apart. Eva also had to face her choices. She was not the person who created the scheme, but she knew something was wrong and stayed silent. I told her, the truth does not only belong to the people who commit the act. Sometimes it belongs to the people who have the courage to speak when something is wrong. Carl struggled too. He apologized for the things he said beside my hospital bed. I listened. But I understood that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness can happen in a moment. Trust has to be rebuilt over time. Months later, I returned to Harris Supply. Walking through those doors again felt different. Before the accident, I thought the company was my greatest achievement. After everything happened, I realized the company was only one part of my life. My real achievement was surviving long enough to understand what truly mattered. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could provide for other people. I stopped believing that being a good father or husband meant allowing others to make choices that destroyed my peace. Love should not require losing yourself. That was the lesson the accident gave me. The hospital bed did not just show me who my family was. It showed me who I was. I was still capable of making decisions. I was still capable of protecting myself. I was still capable of starting again. 1 year after the accident, I visited the hospital where everything changed. I stood outside the room where I had heard the words that broke my heart. If I had never woken up, my family would have divided my life into pieces. They would have remembered what I owned, what I built, and what they could receive. But I did wake up, and because I did, I got something far more valuable than revenge. I got the truth. Today, I no longer ask why the people I loved betrayed me. Some questions do not have answers that bring peace. Instead, I ask what I learned from it. I learned that age does not make you powerless. Kindness does not make you weak. And family is not proven by words. It is proven by choices. The people who truly love you will protect your dignity when you are vulnerable. They will not see your weakness as an opportunity. They will not wait for your absence to decide your value. I survived the accident. I survived the betrayal. And most importantly, I found myself again. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not watching the people who hurt you fall. Sometimes the greatest victory is standing back up and realizing they never had the power to take away who you were. The final thing I learned was that protecting your family and protecting yourself are not opposite choices. The people we love should never need us to disappear so they can succeed. A healthy family does not ask you to sacrifice your dignity, your freedom, or your future. It helps you stand stronger. And after everything I lost, that was the one thing nobody could take from me again, the right to choose my own life.